It is my great pleasure and honor now to be speaking to you on the concept of rationality in Christianity. And as Sandra just said, according to an earlier stage of planning, I would now be sitting here in order to introduce to you our next speaker, but since he is ill, unfortunately, it is now my honor to be introducing to you the concept. So I had 1.5 days to 2 days to prepare, which means let me just make a short preliminary remark and little disclaimer before I start. So picture before you a Japanese ink painting, which was painted with great spontaneity, with the single strokes all being placed in a very precise manner, but which also contains some empty space, which is part of that beautiful form of art. And then picture next to that one of these old oil paintings, with all the different kinds of shades of color put one on top of each other, which has been worked and reworked and reworked. So what I can attempt now is, of course, the first kind. That is my little disclaimer. But I think it is nevertheless a beautiful form of art, and I'm attempting to be placing my rather spontaneous strokes of ink paint now in the most beautiful and precise manner. And then, second preliminary remark, as Sandra just said, the concept of rationality in the whole of Christianity is, of course, a rather daunting task to present. So I would like to make it transparent from the beginning on that I am speaking mainly out of a Catholic perspective, which is the perspective that I know best. I will refer to the Church Fathers and also to non-Catholic authors, but my main perspective really lies within Catholicism, and I just wanted to make that transparent. So, having said that, let's jump right in. So, to lay the foundation, I would like to start with a quotation from the Gospel of John, so the first chapter of John. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And the world became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Plenum veritatis, full of truth. So the famous prologue of St. John starts with the Logos, who is the Son of God from all eternity, through whom creation was made, and who has entered into the contingency of this world's history. So we see here a tension of two positions, the eternal Logos and the historical contingency of his incarnation. And it is this tension and complementarity that will have to form the principal focus of this presentation. Just a little question, are you all able to hear me well? Is it okay? Okay, wonderful. So, reason and faith, a relationship of contrast. There is indeed a relationship of contrast between philosophy and theology, reason and faith, we can say. It can be read in several ways. I will first of all point out the very long and intensive tradition of complementarity of rationality and faith in Christianity, and thus point to a fairly positive and trustful regard on rationality from a Christian perspective. Secondly, I will refer to critique of religion from a philosophical point of view, but also from within the biblical perspective. A third step will then have to point out that within Christian thinking and Christian mysticism, we also encounter the observation of the insufficiency of natural and supernatural knowledge, with the foolishness and scandal of the cross, and also on the level of spiritual life, with the term the dark night of the soul. We even have to consider the point that faith itself can create nights, darkness, for human understanding. I will here cite philosopher and mystic Edith Stein, referencing John of the Cross. This thought, of course, leads from the purely rational level to the mystery of relationship between God and the human soul. Finally, going back to the Logos, I will close my presentation with remarks by and on Professor Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and the notion of reason standing at the threshold of the sanctuary. So, my first point, complementarity. For one, the relationship between reason and faith can be regarded as complementary, at least up to the Enlightenment. So reason can support faith because the positive prescriptions from revelation can be made intelligible or lucid. This is what the interpretation of the Logos by the Church Fathers up to Joseph Ratzinger, the Catholic Pope Benedict XVI, shows. As Professor Gal Falkowitz, the philosopher of religion to whom I am greatly indebted, pointed out, this complementarity of reason and faith, in the sense of an intelligibility of revelation, is true even with regard to the Trinity. The Trinity is thus explained as not irrational for thought, but rather as a paradigm of relationship, or more precisely, a unit which is distinct in itself and which includes the other. We see many examples for this position of complementarity, famously, for instance, in the theology of Thomas Aquinas or Augustine of Hippo, although this position should, of course, not be confused with an exhaustive explanation of faith by reason. Let me delve into this position further, looking at the early use of the concept of rationality. Tertullian and Apuleius, so 2nd and 3rd century authors, both use the term rationalitas in their theories on the human soul. So now we are talking about anthropology. So Tertullian, the 2nd century Christian author, describes rationalitas as one of the natural attributes of the human soul, alongside with, for example, immortalitas, intellectualitas, or sensualitas. Both authors assume Cicero's translation of the Greek term logos by the Latin term ratio. The translation of logos by ratio also forms the foundation for the use of the famous Aristotelian definition of the human being as animal rationale, so the human being as a rational creature. In this sense, we also find usage of the term among later Christian authors like Anselm of Canterbury, Albertus Magnus, and Johannes Duns Scotus. So, rationality as an anthropological point. In this context, we now also have to refer to the term recta ratio, or orthos logos in Greek, which can be translated into English as right reason or right discernment sometimes. Throughout its conceptual history, the term recta ratio was, of course, used in heterogeneous ways, so used partly in a subjective, partly in an objective sense. But always the meanings, however, had the idea of a norm or a binding law and the possibility of human insight into it. So, a binding law and the possibility of human insight into it. Augustinus of Hippo, the famous 4th century doctor of the Church, developed the term recta ratio as objectively oriented thoughts in accordance to an eternal law or law of nature. So, thoughts in accordance to an eternal law or law of nature. And this is a concept that plays an important role, for example, in Christian ethics until today. In fact, referring to a binding law of nature and our possible insight into it, so rational insight into it, often enough forms part of the introductions to Christianity by numerous authors. As only one example, let me name here the Anglican author and Oxford professor of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, who starts his book Mere Christianity exactly in this way. So pointing out rationality and a natural law. For this general trust into the human capacity of rational insight, a long tradition of thinkers can thus be cited. I cannot move on from this point without having quoted the famous definition of 13th century doctor of the Church, Thomas Aquinas. Veritas est adequatio rei et intellectus. So this points us to the goal of human rational insight, which is adequation with reality. Truth would be adequation of our intellect with the things. even though our reason is of course not infallible, especially also due to sin, which is why our human reasoning needs God's revelation, as Aquinas explains. And this is something that we will come back to later on in my presentation. But let us now go into the teachings of the Catholic Church on human rationality, as it can be found in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this large document was commissioned by the 20th century Catholic Pope John Paul II, and it provides us with a very comprehensive overview of the Catholic Church's teachings after the Second Vatican Council. It is also termed the World Catechism, and can definitely be regarded as a highly authoritative source. In preparation for this presentation, I therefore analyzed and the expressed view on human rationality in the Catechism. Already in part 1, the headline of the very first chapter reads, "Man's capacity for God." So, the human person is here seen as capax Dei, as capable for God. I quote, "The desire for God is written in the human heart, because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and the happiness he never stops searching for." Unquote. So the human being is here presented as ever searching for truth, which we could in its fullness find only in God himself. Only in God is the fullness of truth, therefore. I would like to also point to the fact that from the beginning on, the Catechism does not speak about man's capacity for God only in the term of human rationality. We definitely do hear about that, but we also read about the human heart. So rationality forms a highly important part of the human capacity for God, but not in a sort of hypertrophied way. The Catechism goes on, I quote, "The dignity of man rests above all on the fact that he is called to communion with God. This invitation to converse with God is addressed to man as soon as he comes into being. For if man exists, it is because God has created him through love, and through love continues to hold him in existence. He cannot live fully according to truth unless he freely acknowledges that love and entrusts himself to his Creator." Unquote. So, the human person is capable of God and continually thirsts for truth. But truth is not something which we can only remark. We also have to live according to that truth. That is what the Catechism points out here. And in order to fully live according to truth, the Catechism states that we have to lift that purely rational level up to entrusting ourselves to the Creator. So we can definitely summarize until this point that there's a very high esteem of human rationality, but human rationality is placed in context. Let me keep on presenting to you a little bit more from the Catechism, because I think that's really a great sort of foundation. A little further down in the first chapter, the human faculties, as well as faith and reason, are directly addressed. So I quote again, man's faculties make him capable of coming to a knowledge of the existence of a personal God, unquote. So hence the human being would by his natural gift be able to attain knowledge of the existence of God and even of a personal God. I continue with the quote, "But for man to be able to enter into real intimacy with him, God willed both to reveal himself to man and to give him the grace of being able to welcome his revelation in faith," unquote. So we are speaking now of a different level than mere rational insight. This is now about the intimate relationship between God and man. And here revelation and faith importantly come into play. Last part of the quote. "So the proofs of God's existence can predispose one to faith and help one to see that faith is not opposed to reason," unquote. In the context of our question on rationality here, this means that human ratio would be seen as a predisposition to faith. It is clearly stated here that the Catholic Church holds faith as not opposed to reason. We could thus say that faith not opposes, but actually presupposes reason. Faith presupposes reason. This is, in fact, this also forms the foundation for dialogue with other religions. And I just wanted to quote that as well, because that is, of course, very beautiful for our context here right now, seeing rationality as a basis for dialogue among religions. In defending the ability of human reason to know God, the Catechism says, the Church is expressing her confidence in the possibility of speaking about him to all men and with all men, and therefore of dialogue with other religions, with philosophy and science. But how can we speak about the eternal God? Our knowledge of God is limited, so our language about him is equally so. We can name God only by taking creatures as our starting point, and in accordance with our limited human ways of knowing and thinking. As the Catechism says, all creatures bear a certain resemblance to God, most especially man, created in the image and likeness of God. The manifold perfections of creatures, their truth, their goodness, their beauty, all reflect the infinite perfection of God. Consequently, we can name God by taking his creatures' perfections as our starting point, for from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. So let me conclude this first part. According to what we have heard until now, there would be a complementarity of faith and reason. Our reason is limited, but it nevertheless can come to true rational insights that are in accordance with reality. And our reason could even attain the insight about the existence of one personal God. But in order for the human person to enter into an intimate relationship with the Lord, he would have willed to reveal himself. Hence, faith would presuppose human reason, and faith would perfect and lift up human reason. So much for the first part. We now have to look at least briefly at the critique of religion. So the term critique of religion, Religionskritik, owes its origin to the critical philosophy of Kant, although the concept can of course be traced back much further, as shows, for instance, antique Epicureanism or the early critique of religion by Xenophanes, in which the topos of the projection of anthropomorphic imaginations is already found. And we, of course, here in the city of Erlangen, where famous 19th century philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach taught. So I'm referring to him as an example. He argued that the religious worldview was principally an illusionistic reversal of elementary human dispositions. So he's talking about anthropology here. Put in very simple terms, the human condition as weak, imperfect, finite, and so on, would lead us to the projection of an almighty, perfect, eternal being, which we then call God. As a factor of anthropology, religion is thus seen as a representation of human dependencies, needs, dreams, and desires. I do not remain on this point for long, because on this stage I content myself by stating that I'm skipping many names who have, of course, also had important implications in history, like Marx, who focused, of course, on material conditions, also with regard to religion. But under the influence of critique of religion, the demand is voiced to reconcile religion with a critique asserting the principles of reason. And I'm now going to look more into this point because I'm here today to talk about the concept of rationality within Christianity, which is why I now go on to point out that, interestingly enough, also in the Bible itself, we find critique of many religious cults as constructs. So, for example, in Psalm 115 we read, I quote, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouth, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. Aures habent et non audient, oculis habent et non videbunt." So this is a very harsh critique on man-made religious constructs. Psalm 86 exclaims, "Among the gods there is none like you, O Lord." So standing against a plurality of gods, there would be none like the one Lord who is in the heavens. Psalm 150 again, "Our God is in the heavens, he does all that he pleases." Biblical texts can make it clear that there is no disposability towards God. We cannot dispose of God. So also our rationality cannot dispose of him. Rather, we find the notion of the living God, who is much greater than our own ideas and purposes. And he is true and enters into a covenant with human beings. To put it in the words of the World Catechism once more, I quote, "God transcends all creatures. We must therefore continually purify our language of everything in it that is limited, image-bound, or imperfect, if we are not to confuse our image of God, so God, the inexpressible, the incomprehensible, the invisible, the ungraspable, with our human representations. Our human words always fall short of the mystery of God." Unquote. In Christianity, there is a tradition of self-critique. God himself would refuse and withstand our mere wishing. The living God has to be seen as not necessarily conform to our wishing. I will explore this further in the third part of my presentation, which I've titled Science of the Cross. So talking about Christianity cannot be done without talking about the cross, of course. I'm attempting this here by referring especially to Edith Stein. She was a philosopher in the 20th century who studied under and worked for Edmund Husserl himself. She is also a Catholic saint, and as she is part of the monastic order of the Carmelites, she can help us understand Christian mysticism and spiritual life from a highly reflected and rationally reflected point of view. I hold this to be important to touch on in a presentation on rationality in Christianity because it indicates how the way sort of leads further. Stein's final work that she wrote until she was picked up by the Nazis and murdered in Auschwitz is the Kreuzeswissenschaft, or Science of the Cross. In it, she writes about St. John of the Cross, the important 16th century Spanish mystic and father of the Reformed Carmelite monasteries. So I think both persons are very instructive for our topic here, and they both have quite authoritative positions. Edith Stein as one of the Catholic patron saints of Europe, and John of the Cross as Doctor Ecclesiae, one of the doctors of the Church. Studying the works of John of the Cross, Edith Stein formulates a conception of the term science of the cross in the two meanings, theology of the cross and school of the cross, so living in the sign of the cross. She traces the work of John of the Cross, especially ascent of Mount Carmel, so in Spanish, Subida del Monte Carmelo, and also Dark Night, Noche Oscura, in which he systematically treats spiritual life in pursuit of mystical union with Christ. And he's giving advice and reporting on his own experience. Edith Stein then goes on to give an interpretation about his writings. I quote her, "In these attempts to interpretation is expressed what the author," so she, "believes to have grasped in a lifelong effort about the laws of spiritual existence and life." And it is this spiritual existence and life which we have to put, of course, in relationship with rationality in Christianity. So she states, "The cross is no end in itself, but it towers up and points upwards. And it is always the cross of Christ, which means that it does not lead to hopelessness or despair, but to resurrection." So she reflects on the cross in the life of the saint, on the message of the cross in the New Testament, the Holy Eucharist, and on the content of the message of the cross. In relation to our topic here of rationality in Christianity, I especially have to point to what Edith Stein terms the insufficiency of natural and supernatural knowledge in relation to God. because she links the dark night of the soul with the experience of the cross. According to this experience from Christian mysticism, the relation to God and faith itself can create nights, darkness for our human understanding. In Science of the Cross, Edith Stein talks about exposure or deletion of mental powers, the night of faith, the night of the soul, as a way of unification with Christ, exposure of spiritual forces as a way of the cross and as a way of death on the cross. She talks about the insufficiency of natural and supernatural knowledge. She talks about darkness of vision, nakedness of the soul as stages on the way of a deeper unification with Christ. And then there is the subsequent imagery in mysticism of bridal symbolic, cross and resurrection, mystical marriage, and salvation by him who says of himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." It can be argued that these statements and experiences from mysticism are very sharp indeed, and often sharper than forms of criticism of religion. They tell us that God himself breaks our images and constructions. And this is now an important point when it comes to rationality in Christianity, as it points to a kind of counter-intentionality. What does that mean, counter-intentionality? So mere human constructions of religious ideas and practices would be made by us, of course. They hence cannot claim a broad adequation with reality, even though social and political systems can, of course, make fitting religious constructions more durable. So I can just give a simple example. If an emperor institutionalizes himself as a god and has enough military power and enough other men interested in keeping the system alive, it can, of course, stay alive for some amount of time, until this artificial human fixing material proves itself to be invalid. So the problem here, the problem of some man-made constructs, is the invalidity. Vis-à-vis such cases, rational insight is, of course, an important tool in the unmasking critique of man-made invalid systems. But the question is if we can sort of go further than the critique of invalid systems, because that always holds, of course, the danger of skepticism and the kind of circle of construction, deconstruction, construction, critique, and so on. So looking at these testimonies from Christian mysticism, we find indeed a phenomenon that seems to exceed the level of the man-made, the level of the constructed. Rather, there is the experience and also the rational reflection of these experiences. That God sweeps away our constructions and images. In a nutshell, constructions are stemming from us, but the whole point that is made here, and indeed fundamentally with the incarnation itself, can be seen as a kind of counter-intentionality, so God coming. What does that mean for our topic of rationality in Christianity? As has been shown earlier, we can definitely speak of a very high esteem of rationality in Christianity. So faith presupposes reason. But we cannot speak of a kind of self-glorification of rationality in Christianity, because ultimately we have to take in account the encounter with the living God. One of the most beautiful, and we can well say highly paradigmatic scenes for this in the New Testament is the answer of the Blessed Virgin Mary at the Annunciation. So let us just take a look into that. When the angel greets her and reveals to her that she will conceive a son, as we read in the first chapter of Luke, I quote, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God." Unquote. She asks reasonable questions. How can this be, for I see no man, and so on. And she receives a reasonable answer, but one which of course completely exceeds our human Fassungsvermögen, our human comprehension. Then she answers with her fiat, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word." First chapter of Luke. And then of course she receives the Logos himself, the one who says of himself, ego sum, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The one who is the truth. Believing the one who is the truth. As we read in the second letter of Timothy, quote, for I know whom I have believed, scio enim cui credidi. So, believing the one who is the truth. I think they are really on a sort of inner point of the concept of rationality within Christianity. I would like to close these reflections and my presentation with a reference to Professor Josef Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. So, Reason and Faith. In his book, Introduction to Christianity from 1968, there is a heading, The Rationality of Faith. Already in his inaugural lecture in Bonn in 1960, he had stated, I quote, the synthesis of the biblical faith with the Hellenistic spirit as the representative of the philosophical spirit at that time was not only legitimate but necessary in order to express the full claim and seriousness of the biblical faith, unquote. And he continues even more challenging, quote, a religion that cannot be rationalized can then also not be dogmatic if dogma is to be a rational statement about religious content, unquote. So, rationality would be needed in order to express the full seriousness of the biblical faith. What place does rationality hold in Christianity? I would like to propose one final image. Ratzinger speaks about the court of the Gentiles of the Jerusalem temple, and he demonstrates a great trust in human thinking to be open for transcendence. So, rational thinking as open for transcendence. Following the contemporary philosopher of religion, Professor Guy Falkowitz, Ratzinger's term, court of the Gentiles, could be translated as court of reason. Reason that stands before the threshold of the sanctuary. I think that is indeed a very beautiful and instructive image to close this presentation on the rationality in Christianity. In the words of Professor Guy Falkowitz that I translated into English, quote, such trust into reason at the threshold of the saint may be astonishing, but it ultimately contains veiledly, so in a veiled form, the core of the Christian doctrine of the Logos. For the Logos indeed destroys the human logoi, the Word bursts the Word, as the Church Fathers know. But, having become man, the Word also fertilizes the words, even spurs them and sets them free. Already the four Gospels and the letters of the Apostles are attempts to grasp the incomprehensible, unquote. So, attempting to grasp the incomprehensible, but then also receiving the incomprehensible, as we saw in the scene of the Annunciation. Thank you very much.